Hello and welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to go over suspension components that require an alignment after being replaced. And then after that, we're going to go over suspension components that don't require an alignment after being replaced. All right, so this is kind of a video to help you get a heads up and when you're going to a garage or dealership, to kind of give you an idea to what to expect when they're working on your suspension system, also to diagnose noise, and as well when they're going to sell you the alignment, just to be aware of what's happening and why you need an alignment. All right, so we're going to start with the three angles in any car. So in the front and the back, they'll have toe here, camber, and then caster. So toe is basically how straight your wheels are driving. If one wheel is pointing this way and one is pointing this way, then it's going to be really hard to drive straight. So if one wheel is pointing this way and the other one is pointing that way, then you'll have a pulling left issue, and that's basically the gist of the toe angles. So camber is a bit different. So camber is if you're looking at the wheel from, let's say, the rear of the car. So this would be the wheel and this would be your suspension. And camber is basically the angle here, how far in or out the wheel is relative to the fender, so the inner fender. So this on this side would be a negative camber, and on that side would be a positive camber. So we want to stay right in the middle, and that's basically to avoid severe tire wear. Most of the time, if you have negative camber, it's going to chew up the inside of the tire, and then it's going to result in you buying new tires and so on. So caster is a bit different. Say you're facing the car from the side, this would be the wheel, and the suspension would be behind it like this, and then caster would be this angle here. So how far in or out the wheel is relative to the front of the car and the rear. So if it's pushing towards the front, so it would be a positive caster, and then if it's pushing towards the back, then it would be a negative caster. So these are a bit harder to adjust. Usually these are adjusted only with cars that have been in an accident, so you would only adjust them with the subframe, but I'll go over that a bit later. All right, so in the red is going to be all the suspension components that require an alignment after you've replaced them. So 90% of the time, the alignment is going to involve just adjusting the toe. Camber and caster is going to be a bit harder, just because you would need specific caster bolts, but not all cars have caster bolts, but you could get camber bolts for any car. So camber bolts look like these. So they'll have like a notch here where this bolt would be installed here in the strut, and then by turning the bolt, this knob here would go in and out, and then it would adjust the angles up here. So it would either push the wheel a bit out or push it a bit in, just to get the wheel perfectly centered, so you could avoid tire wear and then get your camber angles completely centered. All right, so you have here the strut. So when you replace the strut, especially if you're replacing them with aftermarket parts, so aftermarket parts, they'll have different weights and different dimensions. So of course the parts fit, but what I mean by dimensions is sometimes they're slightly off in one area, then they're not exactly a OEM copy. So that's why when you replace them with aftermarket parts, you're gonna need an alignment. So strut affect the toe as well as a bit of the camber. But if you didn't have a camber issue before, then you shouldn't worry about that. The only way to fix camber is going to be by installing camber bolts, like I said. All right, so front struts always, when replacing them, you should get, well, the shop will will sell you an alignment with it, because it will affect the toe. All right, next up we have so inner tie rod, outer and intermediate shaft. So anything with the suspension, anything with the steering system, if you touch any components, then most likely you will need an alignment. So all of these affect the toe as well. They don't really affect camber. So when you replace these, this is where the toe adjustments happen anyway. So by turning the inner tie rod in and out relative to the outer, and that's going to affect your toe angles. Intermediate shaft, you could get away with no alignments depending on how good the tech is. If he replaces it and puts it exactly where it was, then sometimes you could get away with no alignments. So the intermediate shaft sits right here on the rack and pinion. All right, next up we have, it's pretty obvious, rack and pinion. So rack and pinion, the outer and inner sit here on both extremities. And then if you replace that, that's complete, like that's your whole suspension system. That's the main component of your suspension system. So if you replace this, then immediately you'll be affecting your toe angles. Camber, not so much. And like I said before, caster as well, not so much. It's mostly just the toe. So once you replace that, you're going to need an alignment. For sure, you're going to need an alignment if you replace the rack and pinion. Because when they come pre-assembled, you're going to have to play with these angles here just to get the car to be driving straight. All right, next up we have ball joints. So ball joints, same thing with the strut. If it's an aftermarket ball joint, so different weights and different dimensions. So it's going to affect the front suspension angles. So most of the time ball joints, it's going to affect toe. I've seen ball joints completely ruin a front suspension, especially if they're really cheap aftermarket ones. They completely ruin the suspension. You can't even drive the car straight anymore just because how bad they are. But you know, that's what you get for buying cheap ball joints. So for ball joints, you could get away with no alignments if you do end up getting the OEM ball joint. If you end up getting the OEM ball joint, then I've seen it where it's just a plug and play. So you just take off the old one, put the new one back in. Like I've had experiences with Toyota, and they don't affect the alignment at all. All right, next up we have upper control arm and lower control arm. So same thing with the ball joints. Aftermarket ones, they have different weights, different dimensions, and it could cause the car to pull if you don't get an alignment. So that's why they're always sold. Like a replacement of control arm replacement is always sold with an alignment. And then it also affects the camber. So the bushings here, especially on the upper control arm, affect the camber. So you might, on some cars, they'll have special bolts already installed in the factory. So they'll have already camber bolts where you could do the adjustments on the upper control arm, as well as lower control arm, especially on pickup trucks. They'll have those bolts too, where you could adjust the camber angles. They're a bit more complicated when doing alignments. I've only done a few of them in my professional career, and they're pretty tricky to get because the angles don't move as you want them to, and so you'll have to be careful to when you adjust them. Same thing with this one, rear lower control arm. So this is cars with torsion beam axles. You don't need to, there's no adjustable angles in the back, but cars with rear lower control arms and rear toe arms, you'll need an alignment if any of these have been replaced. So the adjustments happen here. So here would be a bushing as well as a bolt going through, and this is where we would adjust toe for camber for the rear control arms. So if you live in the Rust Belt, if they get up in age, these bushings on the toe arms and the control arms in the back are completely seized. So sometimes if you have bad toe angles and bad camber angles in the back, then there's nothing the technicians can do when it comes to adjusting. So you cannot adjust the toe or the camber in the back because you risk snapping the bolts. So they kind of look like this, the bolts. So if you do snap the bolt, then that's a nightmare job. You're gonna have to extract the bolt and then extract the bushing as well, and then replace all that. So that's why if you have chewed up rear tires in the back, say they're chewed up on the inside because of the camber, then the only way to replace and fix this issue is you're gonna need a new control arm. So 2 new control arms, 2 new toe arms, and then 2 bushings as well here. So sometimes when the shop or dealership calls you and say that you know, a simple $120 alignment could turn into like a you know, $1,000 suspension job. So that's why. It's because these bolts are frozen and there's no way to fix that issue except replace these 2 arms, as well as the toe arms and the bushings, as well as redo the alignment as well. But most of the time, customers never do that. The car, sometimes it's too old to even invest that much money into it, so they'll just ride with that problem. You know, they'll replace tires every few years prematurely, but they don't care about paying $1,000 to fix this issue. But it's a really common issue. I could think of, especially on the Honda Civics, like when they get up in age, they have those issues in the back where no one really addresses the camber issue in the back, just because these bolts on the rear control arms have never been touched, so they're completely frozen. All right, next up we have all the suspension components that don't need an alignment when replaced. So if the garage or dealerships try to tell you or try to sell you an alignment for these, then you know that they're not as honest as they should be. So because these don't affect really the toe or camber angles. So first up we have sway bar bushings. So sway bar bushings don't affect any toe or camber or caster angles. So as soon as you replace them, then you should be good to go. You could drive on. Same thing with links. Links are probably the most common suspension component that goes bad. So I've replaced you know, hundreds of links in my career. So links, it's just you pop them out, pop them back in, and then they don't affect any alignment angles. So links are mostly just noise complaint from the joints being loose. All right, next up, lateral arms. So any lateral arms don't affect angles, just because they're kind of the same thing as links. They bolt in and then they bolt back on. They bolt out and then they bolt back in. So there's very few adjustments when it comes to the ends, the bushings, and so on. But if you do end up getting like a really bad aftermarket one with really bad, say it's really cheaply made, so it comes back to this here. If it's a really lighter or heavier lateral arm, then that could affect the angles in the front of your car. So it could either make your car pull right or left, depending on, you know, how cheap these parts are. But from my experience, we never had really an issue with buying lateral arms. So they're really straightforward components, you know. All right, next up, wheel bearings. Some people think wheel bearings you would need an alignment, but you actually don't. So wheel bearings, either the pressed one or the bolted one here. So when these are replaced, you don't need an alignment, because they kind of just bolt in and they don't really affect toe, caster, or camber. All right, and the last one is going to be the top plate bearing. So top plate bearing is going to be this guy over here. It's the strut. It's the bearing on top of the strut. So when these are replaced and you keep the original spring and shock absorber, then you don't need to do an alignment. So all you have to do is just bolt everything back on, and then bolt the bolts in the front here, and that shouldn't affect toe or camber or either caster. So yeah. All right, and for caster, there is one. So like I said, with cars that got in a wreck, there is one component that do require caster adjustments. So it's the subframe. So when the subframe gets hit from a collision or gets shifted, then the subframe affects the caster angles. So the only way to fix caster angles, and it's only by a few, you know, a few millimeters, not nothing crazy. It's going to be So if you work in a body shop, they would use really big pry bars to shift the subframe. So they would loosen the subframe just a bit, and then they would actually try to shift it with a pry bar just to get the caster angles to go back to normal. And that's the only way I've seen caster angles get fixed. I'm not sure if there's legit caster bolts, but you would have to adjust so many things. So caster bolts would mount on the top of the strut here, but you would have to adjust the holes on top underneath the hood to actually get those to fit. So I'm not too sure about caster angles. I've never had to adjust any of them. All I had to do when I worked at the dealership is going to be just toe adjustments, and that's mostly 99% of all the alignments. No customer ever brought me camber bolts or caster bolts to fix that, so they usually just let the problem sit. And yeah, all right, that's gonna be it for this video, guys. Hope you find it helpful, hope you find it valuable. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.